If one were to look upon this Maryland countryside on June 17th of 1755, you would have found a crudely fortified encampment of a British army containing over 2,000 people. Their commander, General Edward Braddock, had been tasked by King George II with capturing the French outpost of Fort Duquesne, a part of a multi-pronged offensive to drive France out of contested territory in North America. The army's march to this point, called the Little Meadows, was exhausting. But it wasn't just the men's sickly appearance which mortified Braddock, it was the fact that he had only advanced 20 miles. To move his whole force upon Fort Duquesne, Braddock needed to clear a road across the Youghiogheny Mountains, portions of which would follow Washington's own trail from the previous year. The road would need to be 12 feet wide to allow safe passage for soldiers, artillery, and wagons. Wilderness road building was not just about cutting down trees, but also grading down sod, bridging swamps and waterways, and even necessitating blasting through rock. The whole process was carried out by a work party of some 600 men at the head of the army, pulled from both the regular regiments and colonial outfits. While military officers directed a detail up and down mountains like Big Savage, they were doing so at the advice of the army's quartermaster, John St. Clair, a man overwhelmed by the daunting task made trivial in London. What was looked on at home as easy is our most difficult point to surmount. I mean the passage of this vast tract of mountains. I'm not at all surprised we are ignorant of the situation in this country in England when no one except a few hunters know it on the spot, and their knowledge extends no further than in falling their game. It is certain the ground is not easy to reconnoiter, for one may go 20 miles without seeing before him 10 yards. The cache of entrenching tools sent overseas was insufficient for the work party. St. Clair's efforts to procure more tools from the colonies was met with the same difficulties as he had been faced with procuring wagons. Notorious for his short temper, St. Clair used threats of military force upon colonists to free up resources for the British Army. But his rogue tendencies also afflicted Braddock. St. Clair was to have scouted the line of march months before the army had reached Fort Cumberland. Now, the routes he had fought would suffice were being questioned by engineers and regular officers, necessitating detours that added to the growing delay in the general's schedule. The Braddock Road was not the only trailblazing on the minds of Braddock and St. Clair. Planning for when they did reach Fort Duquesne, Braddock had negotiated the colony of Pennsylvania to build an auxiliary supply road out of Shippensburg, Pennsylvania, which would link up with Braddock's road somewhere deep within the Youghiogheny Mountains. Construction was under the care of one James Bird, a Scottish immigrant who had a knack for civil engineering. By mid-June, this Bird's road had reached the Youghiogheny River, but was far from finished. Regardless of what road you were building for Braddock, you needed immense energy to tame the Youghiogheny Mountains with just hand tools, or even simply marching over the completed road grade. Even in food, Braddock was handicapped. With colonial settlers difficult to negotiate on prices and a dangerous wilderness to be hunting within, the army's main diet consisted of rations of salted meats and hard biscuit. The Mingo and colonial scouts would bring in wild game when they could, but it was not enough for 2,500 soldiers. Worst of all was the foul water sources that dotted the line of march. All this and many more hazards that I do not have time to list threatened to destroy the main army when it staggered into the Little Meadows between June 16th and 17th. Braddock knew he had to modify his strategy. At a previous camp, he had hosted a council of war to seek advice on improving the army's speed. Now at Little Meadows, Washington claims that conferred directly with the general. The general, before they met in council, asked my private opinion concerning the expedition. I urged in the warmest terms I was able to push forward. If we did it with a small but chosen band, with such artillery and light stores as were absolutely necessary, leaving the heavy artillery baggage with the rear division of the army, to follow by slow and easy marches, which they might do safely while we were advanced in front. As one reason to support this opinion, if we credit our intelligence, the French were weak at the forks, but hourly expected reinforcement, which to my certain knowledge could not arrive with provisions or any supplies during the continuance of the drought. That intel Washington was referring to came from both the Mingo scouts with Braddock as well as Indian agents in the northern colonies, and would fuel what could be called the turning point of the entire campaign. From Little Meadows, Braddock was going to divide his army into two distinct columns. A flying column of approximately 1,200 men, led by Colonel Peter Halkett, would continue the advance. They would only be supported by a train of approximately 30 wagons and a dozen pieces of artillery. Halkett's column would subsist on 35 days' worth of provisions, indicating Braddock's determination to reach the forks of the Ohio without any further delay. Halkett's column would also consist of picked men deemed to be the best fit for the breakneck pace Braddock was trying to achieve. The remaining elements of the army would be put into the rear division commanded by Colonel Thomas Dunbar, who would continue the slower pace to ensure additional supplies and heavier guns made it safely over the mountains. While this new strategy was professionally carried out, one cannot help but speculate that any grievances were held in private. Consider you're a member of one of those regiments afoot, having traveled across an ocean, marched through all this foreign land, all with the goal of raising your king's colors over the enemy fort, only to then be told at the 11th hour that after enduring so many dangers, you are not going to take part in the main action. You would be pretty upset, would you not? We are left with this colorful description of the departure of Halkett's column from Little Meadows. The army marched out, the knights swearing in the van, the general cursing and bullying in the center, and their whores bringing up the rear. One thing that splitting the army could not mediate was the unforgiving topography. Traversing another 12 miles was too much for Washington. At Bear Camp, the general's colonial aide could no longer mount a horse or even ride in a wagon, brought down by an intense fever. In a letter to his brother, Washington describes the great lengths the general went on to protect the young aide's well-being. The physician on hand administered Dr. James Powder, a popular remedy for aches and pains of the mid-18th century, and lambasted in the 21st century as quackery. But Washington would develop a lifelong admiration for the medicine from this experience, claiming to have mostly recovered within just 4 days. Still, his movements would be restricted to Dunbar's column for some time, holding on to the general's promise he could be called forward when the army was near Fort Duquesne. On June 24th, Braddock's flying column made their great crossing of the Youghiogheny River. In 1755, the river was tinged brown, measuring an estimate 100 yards wide and 3 feet deep. We crossed very early in the morning. The crossing of this river was extremely beautiful and afforded us a pleasant prospect. It undoubtedly appeared to us much more so having had nothing but a continued thicket to march through since our first setting out. As you can see, the vicinity of great crossings has significantly changed. In the early 19th century, the village of Summerfield sprouted a mile downriver from Braddock's actual ford. Its dominant feature was a 3-arch stone bridge which carried the main thoroughfare across the Yough. But in the 1940s, everything but the bridge was leveled by the Army Corps of Engineers, who dammed the river as part of a massive flood control initiative for the forks of the Ohio. However, the Great Crossings Bridge has gained newfound fame. Periods of drought necessitate controlled release into the river valley below, occasionally exposing the bridge. This phenomenon has been locally known for decades, but it seems it was only in 2014 when it became internet famous. Something the sightseers to this Laurel Highlands and Lanterns don't get to see is the 1912 DAR marker denoting Braddock's march through the region. When Summerfield was leveled, the marker was relocated 3 miles west to Addison, PA. Today, it rests in front of an 1835 toll house. Since leaving Little Meadows, Braddock was aware he was not alone in the woods. The army would come across traces of enemy war parties. In addition to abandoned camps and footprints, they also came across depictions of scalping carved into the bark and torn cloth reminiscent of their own uniforms. There are some accounts that even describe brief moments of gunfire being exchanged between the scouts of the rival armies. But a full-scale attack never transpired. The general credited this to the disposition of his line of march.
When in marching the men, I've employed them by platoons on each side of the wagons, so that if we stop, they immediately face outward in the line of battle. In addition, we had advance guards placed out at least 200 yards in front of the main column. In front of that, In front of the main column, between the advance guard, was the van, which is 100 yards, all within supporting distance. And to the rear, we have also placed our rear guard. On occasion, depending upon the nature of the land, forms that we're traveling through, I deployed sergeant's guards of 12 men on our flanks, and the column moved only as fast as our van and our flankers could. And this has been very, very successful, because we have only lost a very few men, and that has largely been due to stragglers. The enemy has tried to get close to us, but they've never been able to get to our camp. And from what they may be seeing is just, instead of a definable force, they only know that there is a large force of His Majesty's army coming to them.
So I am walking on a trace of the Braddock Road. Actually, we're in Fort Duquesne National Battlefield, and it's very closely linked to the Braddock campaign, not just because it's kind of what spawned Braddock having to come over here and mop up Washington's mess, but also the road, their advance goes right around Great Meadows, where Washington had his doomed stand, that little thing upon the meadow. And man, it's one thing when you read about them cutting this road. Well, it is a road in their idea. To us, it's no more than a trail. This road across the Youghiogheny Mountains. It's one thing to read about it. It's another thing then to walk on it and think, my God, they had to go up and down, all these hills, up and down again. I've actually walked up and down this hill a few times just to kind of exhaust myself, to psych me up, to get a feeling for what it was like to cross this road. And you're dealing with ridges, you're dealing with swampy ground, mud if it rained heavily, which it's been raining heavily here in Pennsylvania recently. So yeah, not fun having to march on Braddock's Road. I'm happy to know that even in 1755, PennDOT could set up cones on Braddock's Road. The army would pass around the Great Meadows without incident, but as they're passing, keep in mind, right over there would have been the ruins of Fort Necessity. Everybody's passing that. Everybody knows this is partly why they've been sent out here, to avoid that from happening again. And there are descriptions of finding bleached bones throughout the Great Meadows as Braddock's army traverses through here. So yeah, you could probably imagine some of these soldiers that have never been in battle before, but new recruits in the 44th and 48th. That's an omen. But as long as they get over Chestnut Ridge, they should be safe.
On June 27th, the flying column descended down the western slope of Chestnut Ridge. For Braddock's men, it marked the last ridgeline of the Youghioghenies they would have to cross, but it also necessitated a drop that reaches upwards to 1,000 feet. Even today, reaching the crest of this ridge offers a grand vista of the eastern fringes of the Ohio River watershed. It also requires the sacrifice of several months of use from your brakes when you make the descent. Incredibly, the bulk of the column made the plunge without a major incident. Once at the foot of the ridge, they encamped on land known as Gist's Plantation. This had once been the home of George Washington's wilderness guide, Christopher Gist. His homestead was destroyed in the summer of 1754 by French and Indian forces during the build-up to the Battle of Fort Necessity. Now, Gist was a guide to Braddock in his campaign. On Gist's Plantation, Braddock laxed his restraint on alcoholic provisions to boost morale. Every man was to receive a ration of rum for good behavior upheld during the treacherous crossing of the Youghioghenies. It felt to many in the ranks the worst was behind them. On the final day of June, they crossed the Youghiogheny River for a second time at a place known as Stewart's Crossing, and began to navigate the swamps and thickets that lay between them and the French fort. In roughly 2 weeks, Halkett's column had cut through over 50 miles of wilderness. Meanwhile, Dunbar's column had not even covered half that ground. The gap between the two columns of the army were increasing with each passing day. By July 3rd, the flying column were camped near a salt lick. Today, this is near the crossroads community of Newsstand. Fitting, for its Salt Lick camp, Braddock too was at a crossroads in his strategy. St. Clair proposed to halt the flying column, diverting Halkett's horses to expedite Dunbar's advance. Therefore, the army may attack Fort Duquesne at full strength. However, at a council of war held at Salt Lick, there was a unanimous objection to the notion. Even with the ground covered, Braddock was still greatly behind schedule. His officers feared any further delay would only help the French prepare for the forthcoming battle over the Forks. There was also the matter of the flying column's dwindling provisions. Sitting consuming rations while awaiting Dunbar to come to their relief was just seen as unpractical. So it was that Braddock continued steaming ahead toward Fort Duquesne. But while Braddock closed the distance toward his enemy, an omen struck the flying column. On the same day a scouting party returned with the scalp reportedly of a Frenchman, reports spread of an ambush upon part of the British march. Braddock's aide Robert Orme left an account of what followed. 3 or 4 people loitering in the rear of the grenadiers were killed by a party of Indians and scalped. Upon hearing the firing, the general sent back the grenadier company, on whose arrival the Indians fled. They were discovered again a little after by our Indians in the front, who were going to fire upon them, but were prevented by some of our outrangers, who, mistaking these our Indians for enemy, fired upon them and killed Montatuca's son. Having only a handful of Amerindians to support him, it was a death Braddock could ill afford. At the next encampment, named after Scarorady's Shawnee name, the general ordered that the young man be buried with full military honors. Orme would claim the gestures made by the general in the wake of this friendly fire affair actually increased the trust between the army and their Mingo scouts. But since passing the Great Meadows, there are some who believed Braddock's relationship with the natives was deteriorating. The death of Scarorady's son also crystallizes just how easily the army could unravel into chaos even as their grueling march neared an end. By July 8th, the army advanced within 12 miles of their objective. The general was operating under the belief the French had not improved the defenses of Fort Duquesne. Nevertheless, he was not letting his guard down. During the day, the grenadiers were sent ahead of the vanguard, and some 350 flankers were deployed on the high ground on either side of the march. As the army made what may be their final camp before battle, the general was reunited with his colonial aide. True to his word, he had called for Washington so he may be on hand to see the climax of the campaign. On a bluff overlooking the Monongahela River, one more council of war was held to determine the final approach. It was agreed that although it seemed redundant, it would be much safer to ford the Monongahela twice in order to bypass a deep ravine that would not only be difficult to scale, but was also a prime location for an enemy ambush. So it was, after navigating so many hazards, all that stood between Braddock and victory was a single day's march.
I need a freaking t-shirt for this video when I'm done. I survived Braddock's Road. Your turn next. Something like that. I'm supposed to be the historian. I'm supposed to be telling you about the bad things. I shouldn't be putting myself in bad situations like this.